So, next what I will be covering is scope. So, you see these here braces? You have an opening pair here and a closing pair here, and also here and here. Well, basically, whenever you see a pair of braces, that generally means that there is a new scope. So, what exactly is scope? To show you how scope works, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new file and I'm going to call it scope test. Then I'm going to put in the usual include statements and main function, which I'll explain later. Note also that the main function has a pair of braces, so that's a new scope. So here, there are 4 things that I want to do. The first thing that I want to do is print out a message to the terminal. That message will be instruction 1. And I'm going to put in a comment here, and note that comments are not executed as code, so you can put whatever you want there and the program will not be affected. So I'm just going to call this line here instruction 1. The next thing that I'm going to do is print out a message saying instruction 2. And I'm going to do the same thing 2 more times, except I'm going to make it instruction 3 and instruction 4. Now, if I run this, I should be seeing these 4 messages in the terminal. And I see instruction 1, 2, 3, and 4. So, how a program generally works is that code is executed line by line from the top to the bottom. The first instruction was instruction 1. After that was instruction 2. Then after that was instruction 3. And the last one was instruction 4. So the code ran in the order that I wrote each line of code. If I were to move instruction 4 to the top, then when I run this, what I should expect to see is instruction 4 and then 1, 2, and 3. And that's exactly what happens. So that said, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to label the main function scope A. The main function has a pair of braces, so that's a new scope. And the first instruction in the main function is going to be create an int variable, call it test variable, and assign it a value of 5. And I'm going to label this instruction 1. What I'm going to do next is add 3 to this number, so the current number itself plus 3. And I'm going to label this instruction 2. Next, I'm going to make an if statement, and I'm going to label it scope B, because there's a pair of braces, so that's a new scope. And the condition will be if test variable is greater than 0. And within the if statement, which I'm also going to label instruction 3, I am going to make a string, call it message, and its value will be test variable is greater than 0. And I am going to output this message to the terminal. And then finally, I'm going to print out a message to the terminal, and that message will be program has completed. And I'm going to label this instruction 4. So if I run this thing, what I should be seeing is test variable is greater than 0, since 5 plus 3 is greater than 0. And then finally, the program has completed, as that is the last instruction. Now, what would happen if I were to say change the value of this message variable, but after the if statement? As you can see from the red underline, this is an error and is not going to work. I'm going to run this anyways, and as you can see, I get an error, which is message not declared. So why does this not work when the message variable clearly does exist? Here's why I'm getting that error. Note that the main function has a pair of braces, so that's a new scope. I had labeled the main function scope A. The if statement also has a pair of braces, meaning that that is also a new scope. The if statement, scope B, is inside of the main function, scope A. So, we have scope A, which was the main function. Then we have scope B, which was the if statement that was inside of the main function. And because scope B, the if statement, is inside of the main function, scope B branches off of scope A. Scope B, the if statement, also contains the message variable. Finally, we have the code before scope B, which was creating the int and then adding 3 to it. And then we have the code which went after scope B. This was the message to the terminal saying that the program was completed. So, this is what's happening. First, the code before scope B runs, so creating the int and then adding 3 to it. Then, scope B, the if statement, executes. Finally, the code after scope B executes, and scope B was the if statement. This was the message to the terminal saying that the program was completed. So, this is what's happening. Whenever a scope executes, the code within that scope runs. So, when this if statement, scope B, runs, then this stuff here, which is inside the if statement, executes. And then, once this if statement has executed, the code which is inside of it no longer exists once the scope has finished executing. That's why the message variable doesn't exist after the if statement has executed. It existed when the if statement ran, but then after that was done, the code within the if statement basically deleted itself. Now, what happens when I do this? I'm just going to delete this bit here. Then, I'm going to create the message variable outside of the if statement, but before it. I'm going to run this thing, and it works. So basically, this is the general rule. Whenever you have a scope which branches off of another scope, variables which exist before the scope can be accessed. The reverse is not possible. Variables within the new scope are not accessible within the parent scope that the new scope branches off of. Now, scope does have an impact on performance. Basically, as long as something is in scope, memory and processing power will be used. That essentially means that in C++, you have to manually manage memory. Now, that's not as hard as it might seem. All you really have to do is just keep things in scope for only as long as you need them. Now, there is another way of managing memory. You can manually create and delete variables and other objects with new and delete. Now, as I'm recording this, I've never had a reason to use new or delete, but if I did, this is what I would do. I would look up C++, new and delete, because I know they exist already. And then I would find a source like this, and then read through it to see how it works, and then find an example for reference, like this. And of course, I would adapt it to my specific needs. So, this is how you would manually create and delete objects if you really wanted to. So, back to the program. Now, how do we generate a random password which is of the exact length that the user has specified? So, I'm going to make a test file, then include the usual include statements and main function, and now I can do some testing. So now, let's say that I wanted to generate a password that was 5 characters long. So I could just get 5 random letters or numbers, then just string them together. So I could do this. First though, I need to include the string library because I'm going to be using strings. I'm going to make a string to hold the first random character, and I'm just going to give it a placeholder value because, well, I don't have a random character yet. Then I'm just going to copy the string I just made 4 more times. Then I'm going to make a string to hold the final password, and the value of the string will simply be a concatenation of the 5 random characters. One way this can be achieved is by simply adding up each of the random characters with a plus sign. Now, if I output this string of random characters to the terminal, what I should see is 5 A's. So let's run this thing and see what happens. And that worked. I see 5 A's. Now, what if I wanted a password that was 6 characters long? What I could do is I could just make another copy of the string which holds the individual random character. Then I would have to add that extra character to the final password string. Now, if I run this, I should see 6 A's. And I do. The problem with this method is that the password length is hard-coded. What I want is to generate a random password of any length. So here's what I can do instead. What I can use is a for loop. So for now, I'm just going to comment out what I just did, and this is how you can comment out multiple lines at the same time. So, to make a for loop, this is what you do. You start with for, and then a pair of round brackets, and then a pair of braces. What a for loop does is it basically counts from one number to another. First, you have to set the number that the count starts from. To do this, you make a variable, so I'm going to make an int, and the value is the number that the count starts from. So, from 1 to 5, the count starts at 1. Next, you need the ending condition. Think of it like this. The loop runs as long as this condition is true. So, 1 to 5. This means that the loop runs as long as x is less than or equal to 5. And the last part is how much you're counting up or down by. So, I'm counting from 1 to 5. So then, x equals x plus 1. So here, I am counting up by 1. This is achieved by taking the x value, then adding 1 to it every time. The end result is that you have a variable which you can use inside the for loop. For example, what I can do is take this x variable, the one that I'm using to increment the count, and actually print it to the terminal. So, when I run this, what I should see is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I do. If I wanted to count from 1 to 9, for example, then I would expect to see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then all the way to 9. And that's exactly what happens. So now, what I could do is actually create a string outside of this loop, and then I'm just going to leave it blank. And then within the loop, let's say that I want a password which is 7 characters long. So what I can do is count from 1 to 7. Then I can take the blank password, then add a random character to it with every count. Now if I run this, I should get 7 A's. So I'm just going to print out the end result, and if I run this, I get 7 A's. Now let's say I want a password which is 2 characters long. Run this again, and I get 2 A's. How about something insane, like 50 characters long? What I get is a very large number of A's. So if I replace this here number with the number of characters that the user has entered, then I can account for any number of password lengths. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. So I'm going to go back to the password generation program, and if the user has entered in a valid number, what I'm going to do is generate the appropriate number of random characters. And I'm going to do it exactly how I did it before. So I'll start by making a for loop, and for now I'm going to leave the actual loop parameters blank. So presumably, passwords have to be at least 1 character long. What this means is that I have to check if the password length is at least 1. So I'm going to comment this out for now, I'll need it later, and I'm going to make an if statement. I'm also going to move the for loop inside of the if statement. So now, what condition do I want to check for? I want to check if the converted string, which is the user input regarding the password length, is greater than or equal to 1. What I could have also done was check if the converted string was greater than 0. So if it is, then what's going to happen is that the random password will be generated. And in all other cases, do not generate the password and output an error message saying that the password must be at least 1 character. So I'm going to test if everything works so far. No problems yet. And first I'm going to test with a password length of 0. And that works as expected. I see the error message. Now, what if I type in -2? And that works too. I see the error message. That's good. Now that I know that works, time to get back to the for loop. So, what is the starting point of the count? That's going to be 1. And what's the ending condition? That is, as long as the count is less than or equal to the password length that the user has entered. And finally, I am incrementing or counting up by 1. Now I can start on actually generating the password, but first the password string has to exist first. So I'm going to make a string, and I'm going to call it generated password. I'm also going to leave it blank because the for loop will add characters to it. Now, within the for loop, for each count of characters, what I'm going to do is generate a random character. And then what I'm going to do is append the random character to the password string. So for now, I'm just going to use a placeholder value for the random character, since I don't actually have a random character yet. So I'm going to make a string, and I'm going to call it random char, and for now, the placeholder value will be the letter A. Later, I'm going to make this an actual random character, but for now, what I just want to do is make sure that a password of the correct length is being generated. Now, like I did earlier, I'm going to append the random character to the password string, and I'm going to do that simply by adding. Once the password has been generated, I want to display the password. So, I'm just going to copy one of the cout statements, then I'm going to change the message, and the new message will be, your password is, and then a new line, and then the generated password. So, let's see if it works. And I'm going to enter in 67 for the password length. Well, what I see is a lot of A's. There's probably 67, so that works. And just to make sure, what about 5? And I see 5 A's, so that works. Now, On to generating the actual random character.